A 1967 Oldsmobile went off a wooden bridge on Chappaquiddick Island just after midnight. Inside it was Mary Jo Kopechne, 28 years old. Behind the wheel was Senator Edward Kennedy. The car landed upside down in 8 feet of water. One person climbed out. One did not. For 9 hours, Senator Ted Kennedy told no one. No police. No ambulance. No rescue diver. He walked past other guests at a party less than a mile away. He returned to his hotel room. He went to sleep, by his own account, while Mary Jo Kopechne's body remained inside that submerged car. This is the story of what happened to her on Chappaquiddick Island, and what happened to the truth in the decades after. By the time anyone official knew about the crash, 2 boys fishing near Poucha Pond had already spotted the overturned Oldsmobile and called it in. A diver named John Farrar went into the water and found her. Her body was positioned, he said later, in a way that suggested she had survived inside that car for some time, breathing whatever air remained, before the water finally took the rest of the space from her. Help had existed less than a mile away that whole night. It was never called. Mary Jo Kopechne was not a footnote. She was a campaign worker who had given years of her life to a political movement she believed in. A woman the men around her trusted with details they couldn't keep straight themselves. Records suggest she trusted those same people with her safety on the night she died. What came after the bridge tells you exactly what that trust was worth. This is her story. Old Money Tragedy tells the stories hidden beneath wealth, status, family, and reputation. Subscribe for more. Mary Jo Kopechne grew up an only child in Pennsylvania, raised by Joseph and Gwen Kopechne in a household built around Catholic faith and quiet discipline. The Kopechnes were not wealthy. Joseph worked in banking. The family lived modestly in the small town of 40 Fort before later relocating to Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, and friends described a household where education and personal responsibility were treated as obligations rather than options. She attended Caldwell College for Women in New Jersey, a small Catholic institution, where she studied business education. Classmates remembered her as composed, organized, and unusually serious about the idea that work could be a form of moral commitment rather than simple employment. She was active in student government and reportedly well-liked, but not, by any surviving account, a woman who drifted into significance. She built toward it deliberately, one deliberate choice at a time. Her first job out of college took her south, into one of the most racially fraught classrooms in the country at the time, a segregated school in Alabama, where she taught during the early years of the civil rights movement. It was not a comfortable placement, and she did not have to take it. Friends said she wanted to be useful somewhere that mattered, even before she fully understood what political career she wanted for herself. That instinct toward difficult, meaningful work over comfortable, easy work would define most of the choices she made afterward. From Alabama, she moved to Washington, D.C., where she took a position as a secretary for Florida Senator George Smathers. It was a foothold, not a destination. Colleagues from that office said she absorbed the rhythms of Senate staff work quickly, and that she was already, in her mid-20s, looking for something with more weight behind it than routine correspondence and scheduling. She found it in 1968, when she joined the presidential campaign of Robert F. Kennedy. She was good at the job in a way that mattered to the people running the operation. Colleagues described her as the kind of staffer who remembered the number nobody else had written down, the follow-up nobody else had made. She worked in a windowless basement office at campaign headquarters tracking delegate counts. During the Democratic primaries, an assignment that earned her and the other women working there an informal nickname that would follow them for the rest of their lives: the Boiler Room Girls. It was unglamorous work, performed under fluorescent light in a room with no windows, often late into the night. It was also essential work. Presidential campaigns are won and lost on exactly the kind of granular, repetitive tracking that Kopechne and her colleagues did every single day in that basement, counting delegates state by state, updating tallies as primary results came in, flagging discrepancies before they could become disasters on a contested convention floor. Without people doing that work accurately, a campaign cannot function, no matter how charismatic the candidate at the top of the ticket is. When Robert Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in June of 1968, Mary Jo Kopechne was among the staffers who had spent months building momentum around his candidacy. She had reportedly worked in California in the days leading up to the California primary, helping track the exact numbers that would have decided the nomination fight. Friends said his death did not just end a job for her. It ended a version of the future she had been organizing her entire life around. A sense that the meticulous, unglamorous work in that basement had been building toward something that would genuinely change the country's direction. She stayed in Democratic politics anyway. Grief did not push her out of public life. If anything, colleagues said, it deepened her sense that the work still mattered, even without the candidate she had believed in most. That kind of resilience rarely makes it into the historical record of a woman whose death later overshadowed everything she built before it. By the summer of 1969, she was working as a secretary for the Senate Government Operations Committee. Steady, respectable work, the kind that suggested a longer career ahead of her in Washington, not behind a desk forever, but moving steadily toward greater responsibility within the institution she had chosen to serve. Co-workers from that committee said she had begun talking in private conversations about eventually returning to Pennsylvania to get more directly involved in state politics. Not as someone's assistant, but as a candidate in her own right. On July 18th of that year, she traveled to Chappaquiddick Island, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, for a reunion of the Boiler Room Girls. 6 women who had worked together in that basement office gathered with several men connected to the Kennedy political operation. Most of them married, most of them attorneys or campaign staffers who had also worked on the 1968 effort, for what was billed as a casual catch-up tied to a sailing regatta held earlier that day on the vineyard. Kennedy had competed in the Edgerton Yacht Club regatta that afternoon, sailing his boat, the Victoria, before the group reconvened at the rented cottage that evening. Among the men present was Edward "Ted" Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers, and by 1969 the most prominent surviving heir to a political dynasty that had already buried 2 brothers, one to war, one to assassination just 13 months earlier. He was, at that point, widely discussed in political circles as a future presidential contender, perhaps the most plausible Democratic nominee for the 1972 election, carrying both the weight of his family's legacy and the expectations that came with it. The cottage party rented for the evening ran long into the night. There was food. There was drinking by multiple accounts. There was the particular kind of conversation that happens among people who had shared something intense and formative the year before and had not fully processed losing it so suddenly and violently. At some point after 11:15 p.m., Ted Kennedy and Mary Jo Kopechne left the party together, alone in his car, a black 1967 Oldsmobile E. Delmont 88 with Kennedy driving. He later said he was giving her a ride to catch the last ferry back to her hotel in Edgerton, though he had also reportedly told the chauffeur who had driven the group's main car to the party that he himself would handle the keys and not stay much longer. What happened in the next 90 minutes has never been fully agreed upon. What happened in the 9 hours after that has never been fully forgiven. Kennedy later told investigators he made a wrong turn, taking Dyke Road, a dirt path that led away from the ferry landing, toward a narrow wooden bridge with no guardrail, instead of the paved road back toward the ferry that he had used on multiple previous visits to that same island, including earlier that same day. The car went off Dyke Bridge and into Poucha Pond. It flipped as it struck the water and settled upside down in roughly 8 feet of tidal current, the headlights reportedly still glowing beneath the surface according to later testimony from the scene. Kennedy said he tried to free Kopechne from the submerged vehicle. He said he could not. He said the tide and the current made repeated attempts nearly impossible, and that he eventually swam free himself, exhausted, and made his way to shore alone in the dark. He said he then walked back toward the cottage, not to call for help immediately, but specifically to find 2 people he trusted, attorney Paul Markham and his cousin Joseph Gargan. He brought them back to the bridge. He said all 3 men tried again to free Kopechne from the car, diving repeatedly into the dark water. He said all 3 attempts failed. Then he did something that no version of the story, including his own sworn testimony, has ever fully explained to the satisfaction of investigators, journalists, or the family that ultimately buried her. He did not call the police. He did not request a diver. He did not ask anyone on that island with rescue equipment, a boat, or a working understanding of tidal currents to come to that bridge. Instead, according to his own later testimony, he found a way back across the same ferry channel he claimed to have been trying to reach in the first place that night. swimming it himself by his account, despite having just expended significant energy trying to free Kopechne from the car, and returned to his hotel room in Edgartown. He went to sleep. He did not report the crash to police until roughly 10 o'clock the following morning, after first reportedly speaking with friends and advisors by phone from his hotel. By then, 2 boys out fishing near the pond had already spotted the overturned car and called it in. By then, diver John Farrar had already gone into the water and found her. By then, it no longer mattered what Ted Kennedy was finally ready to say. Farrar would tell reporters years later that he believed Mary Jo Kopechne had survived inside that car for a meaningful stretch of time after it sank, breathing from a pocket of trapped air near the back of the vehicle, in the dark, alone, waiting for help that had already been decided against by the only person who knew, that night, that she needed it. He had performed similar rescues before, as the head of a volunteer search and rescue unit on Martha's Vineyard. In his professional opinion, given as a trained diver who understood exactly how those air pockets behave and roughly how long they typically last in a submerged vehicle, the outcome inside that car might have been different if anyone had called him that night instead of the next morning. No one called him that night. The machinery that moved to protect Edward Kennedy moved faster than the machinery that might have saved Mary Jo Kopechne. Within hours of her body being recovered, attorneys connected to the Kennedy family were already arriving on Martha's Vineyard. Statements were already being drafted and reviewed before being given to investigators. Local police chief Dominic Arena later admitted, in interviews given long after the fact, that he felt outmatched from almost the first conversation. A small-town officer suddenly negotiating with a legal and political operation built to manage national crises, not local fatal accidents involving a sitting United States senator. Kennedy pleaded guilty to 1 charge, leaving the scene of an accident causing injury, a misdemeanor under Massachusetts law at the time. He received a 2-month suspended sentence. No charge was ever filed connected directly to the 9-hour delay in reporting the crash. No charge addressed why he and Kopechne left the party alone together that night, or why a route he had driven before on previous visits to the island suddenly became unrecognizable to him in the dark. An inquest followed in January of 1970, held largely behind closed doors at Kennedy's request, its testimony sealed for over a year by appeals from his legal team before a judge's report was finally made public. A grand jury was also separately convened in 1969 to consider the matter further, examining whether additional charges were warranted. It declined to issue any indictment, and Mary Jo Kopechne's parents were never permitted an independent autopsy on their daughter. Kennedy's representatives reportedly reached Joseph and Gwen Kopechne quickly, before Massachusetts state investigators could formally request a post-mortem examination, and the grieving family agreed to have their daughter's body flown back to Pennsylvania for immediate burial. The Massachusetts medical examiner at the time, Dr. Donald Mills, would later say publicly that an autopsy might have answered very specific, very important questions about exactly when Kopechne died and exactly how, questions that, without that examination, were left entirely to the recollection of the one man who had been in the car with her that night. The Kopechnes were a working-class Catholic family. They were, within days of their only child's death, surrounded by people far more practiced in surviving a public crisis than they were in surviving grief. They later said, in separate interviews given over the following years, that they had simply trusted what they were told by people who seemed to know what they were doing, at a moment when they were least equipped to question anything. They eventually filed a civil suit against Kennedy. The case settled out of court, reportedly a little over $140,000, paid through Kennedy's insurance carrier, closing the matter without ever forcing further testimony under oath about exactly what had happened on that bridge, or in the 9 hours after it. 10 days after the crash, Edward Kennedy went on national television and asked the people of Massachusetts directly whether he should resign his Senate seat. The address was carefully constructed with the help of speechwriters and advisors, reportedly drawing on input from family friend Ted Sorensen, and it framed the entire question around his own political future and his own conscience. A speech remembered, in retrospect, less for what it actually explained about the crash than for how effectively it redirected the national conversation toward his potential redemption. He did not resign. He was re-elected the following year, in 1970, by a comfortable margin. He was re-elected again in 1976, in 1982, in 1988, in 1994, in 2000, and in 2006. He held that Senate seat for nearly 40 years, until his death from brain cancer in August of 2009, one of the longest tenures in the history of the United States Senate, built on a legislative record that included major work on healthcare access, civil rights enforcement, education funding, and labor protections affecting tens of millions of Americans. For most of that career, one word followed him into rooms before he physically entered them: Chappaquiddick. Political insiders, journalists, and rivals used it as shorthand for a scandal everyone understood without needing it explained. In detail, a wound treated as common knowledge, discussed in passing during campaign seasons, occasionally raised by opponents, and almost never spoken alongside the actual full name of the woman who died because of it. His wife at the time, Joan Kennedy, was reportedly pregnant during the period immediately following the crash and experienced a miscarriage shortly afterward. A private tragedy that unfolded alongside the public scandal, largely out of view, and one that complicates any simple narrative about who absorbed the consequences of that night and how. Joan would later speak publicly about the years of strain that followed 1969, describing a marriage already under pressure that the scandal made considerably heavier to carry. The scandal resurfaced with particular force a decade later, in November of 1979, when Kennedy formally entered the race for the Democratic presidential nomination against the sitting president, Jimmy Carter. In a televised interview with CBS journalist Roger Mudd just before his announcement, Kennedy was asked directly why he wanted to be president. His answer was widely described as halting and unfocused, and the same interview pressed him again on Chappaquiddick, 10 years after the fact, with the senator still unable to offer investigators or voters a fully coherent account of the missing hours. Many political analysts later pointed to that single interview as a turning point that damaged his campaign before it had truly begun. He lost the nomination to Carter. The press coverage of the case itself shifted noticeably over the decades. In 1969, much of the immediate reporting focused heavily on Kennedy's political survival, whether the scandal would end his career, whether he would run for president, what it meant for the Democratic Party's future. Mary Jo Kopechne's own background, her work on the Robert Kennedy campaign, her ambitions for her own political future, received comparatively little sustained attention in that first wave of coverage. Some feminist commentators and women's organizations, in the years that followed, pointed to the imbalance directly, arguing that the national conversation had effectively treated a young woman's death as a supporting detail in a powerful man's career narrative. A critique that gained more traction in later decades than it had in 1969 itself, when the broader cultural framework for examining that kind of imbalance was still in its early stages. Mary Jo Kopechne does not appear at length in most biographies of Edward Kennedy. When she appears, it is often a single paragraph, sometimes a single sentence, framed as a complication that nearly derailed his career, rather than as the permanent end of her own. She was 28 years old. Friends and family said she had turned down at least one marriage proposal earlier in her 20s because she did not want to give up the political work she found meaningful. Colleagues from the boiler room said she had been seriously considering running for office herself one day, back home in Pennsylvania. Not staying behind the scenes indefinitely, but eventually stepping forward into the kind of room she had spent years organizing on behalf of other people. None of that made the headlines that followed her death. The headlines, almost uniformly, were about him. The contradictions in Kennedy's account of that night never fully closed. Even decades later, even after his own posthumous memoir attempted one final accounting. He said he repeatedly dove beneath the surface trying to free her. Police divers who examined the wreck the next morning found the driver's side window rolled down and open, and noted, in testimony given at the 1970 inquest, that a man with Kennedy's physical conditioning, a competitive sailor with significant swimming experience, should reasonably have been capable of more than the rescue attempt he described under oath. He said he was disoriented, in a state of shock severe enough to impair his judgment for hours afterward. That description is broadly consistent with how witnesses at the cottage described him when he finally reappeared there, soaked and visibly shaken, sometime after midnight. But shock, however real and however well documented as a psychological phenomenon, does not fully explain a hotel bed. It does not explain choosing sleep over a single phone call that would have taken less than a minute to place. He said he confused the road to the ferry landing with the road to Dyke Bridge, despite having visited the island and used both routes on previous occasions that same summer, including earlier that very day during the regatta. Contemporary accounts, including testimony given during the inquest by people familiar with the island's roads, note that the two routes diverge clearly and are not easily mistaken for one another, even at night, even by an unfamiliar visitor, let alone by someone who had driven both roads before. He said he tried to find help nearby and could not locate any. Diver John Farrar, in interviews given long after the case had closed, said a rescue squad with the appropriate equipment existed only minutes away from the bridge the entire time. Equipment and personnel that were never summoned because no call was ever placed requesting them. No single explanation taken in isolation is impossible. Panic distorts memory and behavior in ways that are well documented in psychological literature on acute stress reactions. Shock can produce decisions that look, from the outside, like cold calculation when they were internally closer to simple paralysis. But stacked together, the missed turn on a familiar road, the failed rescue by a strong, conditioned swimmer, the choice of a hotel bed over a phone call, the 9-hour gap before any official report reached police. These explanations stop sounding like a single night of panic and start sounding like a pattern. A sequence of choices that, again and again across an entire night, protected Kennedy's exposure before they protected Kopechne's chance of survival. The villain in this story never appears as a single monstrous act. He appears in a sequence of decisions, each individually defensible in isolation, each collectively damning when placed side by side. A senator who got out of the water and walked away. A young woman who didn't get out at all. And a gap of 9 hours that nothing in the historical record has ever fully accounted for, even now, more than 50 years later. What no contemporary account seriously disputes is that the original crash itself sat squarely on the man behind the wheel. A single moment of driving error on an unfamiliar stretch of dirt road, in the dark after a long night of drinking and conversation. The deeper, more lasting question was never really about the bridge itself. It was about everything that happened in the hours after the car went under it. By the time Judge James Boyle's inquest findings became fully public in the spring of 1970, delayed well over a year by appeals from Kennedy's legal team seeking to keep the testimony sealed from public view, much of the country had already moved past the story, distracted by Vietnam, by the moon landing the same month as the crash, by the relentless churn of a turbulent decade. Boyle wrote, in his formal findings, that he did not believe Kennedy's account of the route taken that night fully matched the facts as he understood them, and he suggested the senator's operation of the vehicle may have been negligent. He stopped short, however, of recommending any further criminal charges beyond what had already been filed and resolved. There was, by 1970, very little institutional appetite left to push the matter further. Kennedy had already won re-election the year before, in November of 1970. Democrats and Republicans in Massachusetts alike largely treated the case as settled. A genuine tragedy, certainly, but a closed chapter rather than an open wound requiring further investigation or accountability. The Kopechne family never experienced it as closed. Gwen Kopechne gave interviews in later years describing the disorientation of those first days after her daughter's death. Lawyers arriving on the island before state troopers had even finished their initial work at the scene. A body released for transport across state lines before any independent medical examination could occur. A settlement check eventually arriving in place of the trial she said she had actually wanted all along. She said, in more than one interview given over the years, that she had wanted answers far more than she had ever wanted money, and that in the end, she received neither in any form that resembled genuine justice or closure. Joseph Kopechne largely avoided cameras and formal interviews for the rest of his life. Family friends said he could not discuss his daughter's death without visible, lasting difficulty, even decades later. A silence that, in its own quiet way, communicated as much about the weight of what happened as any public statement ever could have. Neither parent, in any available record, ever publicly suggested the crash itself had been anything other than a tragic accident. Their grievance was never about the bridge, or about blaming Kennedy for a single moment of driving error in the dark on an unfamiliar road. It was about the 9 hours that followed that moment, and about a system built around wealth, legal access, and political protection that moved to shield a senator's career faster than it moved to find out exactly what had happened to their only child, and faster than it moved to give that child any chance at survival. There is a particular, quiet kind of erasure that happens to people who die adjacent to powerful men. It rarely looks like outright cruelty in the moment it occurs. More often, It looks like a paragraph buried deep inside a 600-page biography. A settlement check that quietly closes a file. A Senate seat held for nearly 4 decades by the man who climbed out of the water that night while she did not. Mary Jo Kopechne is buried beneath a headstone in Larksville, Pennsylvania, that records only her name and her dates. Nothing about Chappaquiddick, nothing about the 9 hours, nothing about what divers found when they finally reached her the following morning. Visitors have left flowers there for decades. Some have left handwritten notes addressed to a family she was never actually part of and never would have been. Her grave has, at various points over the years, drawn more attention from strangers passing through Pennsylvania than her actual life ever drew from the national press while she was living it. The other boiler room girls, the women who had shared that windowless basement office with her during the frantic months of the 1968 campaign, largely avoided extensive public interviews in the years immediately following her death. Many of them continued working in and around Democratic and Kennedy-affiliated political circles for years afterward, and friends said a sense of loyalty to that broader political world kept several of them quiet for a long time, even when journalists came asking for their perspective on the woman they had worked alongside. Decades later, some of that silence loosened. Several of the surviving boiler room girls gave on-record interviews for documentaries revisiting the case in the years after Kennedy's own death in 2009, finally describing Mary Jo Kopechne in terms that had almost never made it into the original 1969 newspaper coverage of the crash. Funny in a dry, understated way. Devout without ever being rigid or judgmental about it. Careful with money the way people often are who grew up without much of it. Ambitious in a manner she rarely advertised out loud, but that colleagues noticed clearly in the quality and seriousness of the work she chose to take on. A woman who was, by every surviving account from P.O.P. Lou who actually knew her, planning a future that ended permanently on a dirt road most Americans had never heard of until the morning after she died on it. Edward Kennedy addressed Chappaquiddick only sparingly across the remaining 4 decades of his public life, typically when directly pressed by reporters or political opponents during difficult campaign seasons, including during his failed 1980 primary challenge against Carter, when the question followed him into nearly every debate and town hall. In his memoir, published shortly after his death in 2009, he wrote that his conduct on the night of July 18, 1969, had been inexcusable, citing panic and what he called an inexplicable failure of judgment that he said he regretted for the rest of his life. Even in that final, posthumously published accounting, his last opportunity to clarify the record entirely on his own terms, with no more elections left to win or lose, he did not resolve the specific timeline discrepancies that had troubled Judge Boyle 4 decades earlier. He did not offer, in any documented account before or after that memoir, a fully detailed explanation of precisely what occurred during the gap between leaving the bridge and walking into the police station the next morning. He went on, in the years that followed the scandal, to chair significant work on the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. He helped shape legislation that expanded healthcare access, strengthened labor protections, and reinforced civil rights enforcement for millions of Americans across nearly 4 decades of continuous Senate service. Colleagues across party lines, when he died in August of 2009, frequently called him one of the most effective legislators of his generation. A description that dominated most of the obituaries written about him that week, including from political opponents who had clashed with him for decades. Mary Jo Kopechne received, by comparison, only a handful of sentences in those same obituaries, almost always filed under a subheading like controversy or simply Chappaquiddick, as though her death's primary historical significance was as a complication in someone else's 40-year career, rather than the permanent, irreversible end of her own 28 years on Earth. Here is what the historical record actually supports, without serious dispute, even after more than 50 years of scrutiny journalism, and at least one formal inquest. A 28-year-old political aide died inside a car that a sitting United States senator was driving. He left the scene of the crash. He did not report it to authorities for approximately 9 hours. The diver who eventually recovered her body believed, based on her position inside the vehicle, that she had survived for some time after the car went under, breathing from a trapped air pocket, in the dark, waiting for help that never came. No independent autopsy was ever permitted, and the family says they were never given a real opportunity to insist on one before her body left the state. The driver faced exactly 1 misdemeanor charge and received a suspended sentence rather than any jail time. He was re-elected to the Senate the following year and held that seat for the rest of his life. Here is what remains genuinely unresolved, even now, more than half a century later. The precise minute-by-minute sequence of what Kennedy actually did during those 9 hours between the crash and his eventual report to police. The real reason a familiar route to the ferry was abandoned that night in favor of an unfamiliar dirt road toward Dyke Bridge. And whether a faster call for help, a call that, by Farrar's own professional account, should have taken only minutes rather than hours to produce a trained rescue diver at the scene, might have changed what those divers ultimately found inside that car the next morning. Mary Jo Kopechne never got the chance to answer any of those ring questions herself. She left no public account of her own version of that night. No interview followed her death, no later memoir, no clarifying statement given decades after the fact by her own hand, because there were no decades left for her in which to give one. The bridge at Dyke Road still stands today, rebuilt and reinforced over the decades since 1969, narrower and far more clearly marked than it was on the night the Oldsmobile went off it. Visitors to Chappaquiddick occasionally seek the spot out deliberately, drawn by curiosity, by documentaries, or by decades of continuous news coverage revisiting the case. What they find, in daylight, is a small, unremarkable wooden crossing over quiet tidal water. A place that offers no visual hint of what happened there, no historical marker explaining its lasting place in American political history, nothing to suggest that a senator's 40-year career and a young woman's entire future diverged permanently at that exact, otherwise unremarkable point on an island most people will never visit. It does not look, in person, like a place where one person's future ended permanently while another person's continued for 40 more years, almost entirely undisturbed by what happened there. Mary Jo Kopechne is buried in St. Vincent's Cemetery in Larksville, Pennsylvania, beneath a headstone that records only her name and her dates of birth and death. Nothing about Chappaquiddick, nothing about the 9 hours that followed the crash, nothing about the questions that, even now, still surround the dark water beneath that bridge.